Society will develop a new kind of servitude which covers the surface of society with a network of complicated rules, through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd. When the taste for physical gratifications among them has grown more rapidly than their education, the time will come when men are carried away and lose all self restraint. It is not necessary to do violence to such a people in order to strip them of the rights they enjoy. They themselves willingly loosen their hold. They neglect their chief business, which is to remain their own masters. That is Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, Volume 2. This is AllMinucOne, and my name is Bill. Now, you may be asking, who is Tocqueville? And in short, he was a French liberal philosopher born briefly after the French Revolution on July 29th, 1805. He was an avid writer, often pondering about the differences between America and the old world aristocracy. He also wondered much about the French Revolution and why it was so different from the American Revolution. Another quote: "It's not an endless, expanding list of rights, the right to education, the right to health care, the right to food and housing. It's not freedom. That's dependency. Those aren't rights. Those are rations of slavery. Hay and barn for human cattle." Now, here he notes the difference between positive and negative rights. Positive rights always require the demand from others. Thus, force must be applied and control the individual's labor, and their profits goes to other people. Another quote: "Our contemporaries are constantly racked by two warring passions. They feel they need to be led and the desire to remain free. Unable to destroy either of these contrary instincts, they seek to satisfy both at once. They imagine a single, omnipotent, tutelary power, but one that is elected by the citizens. They combine centralization with popular sovereignty. This gives them some respite. They console themselves from being treated as wards by imagining that they have chosen their own protectors." And here he gets to the rub. "Each individual allows himself to be clapped in chains because at the end of the chain is held not by a man or a class, but by the people themselves." Now, excuse me. Now, one thing that he understood deeply was the nature of human beings, or at least of his time. But that nature hasn't changed much all throughout history. Human beings are still human beings. And we will discover that later in some other reading that we're going to do. With that, he also was able to be a prophet like many before and after him. One such of the prophecies that he predicted was the conflict between the U.S. and Russia. Quote: "All other nations seem to have nearly reached their natural limits, and they have only to maintain their power, but these are still in the act of growth. All the others have stopped, or continue to advance with extreme difficulty. These alone are proceeding with ease and salutary along a path to which no limit can be perceived. The American struggle is against the obstacles which nature opposes to him. The adversaries of Russians are men. The former combats the wilderness and the savage life, the latter civilization with all of its arms. The conquest of America are therefore gained with the plowshare, those of the Russian by the sword. The Anglo-American relies upon personal interest to accomplish his ends. and given free scope to the unguided strength and common sense of the people. The Russian centers all the authority of the society in a single arm. The principal instrument of the former is freedom, of the latter, servitude. Their starting point is different, and their course are not the same. Yet each of them seems marked out by the will of the heavens to sway the destinies of half the globe. And that again is from Democracy in America. Now, this struggle goes beyond just the American versus Russia struggle. He wrote that about 100 years before the Cold War. As he wrote that, he could see that there was this enduring struggle of something deeper. And on one end, it's liberty and personal responsibility to the family, the community, and to participate in government. And on the other is slavery, libertine hedonism, and this allows the masters to dictate and control the ever-increasing list of everyday life. Now, if we fast forward to the 1920s, a gentleman named Yevgeny Zamyatin, I'm probably pronouncing that very, very poorly, Zamyatin, who was born in 1884, was one of the old Bolsheviks. That is the unofficial name for the original elite Bolshevik members from before 1905 within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Before the Russian Revolution of 1917, the old Bolsheviks became leaders in the beginning of the Soviet Union. Most notably, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin were of this group. Many died of natural causes, but the ones that did remain in power were eventually killed during the Great Purge. And you have to understand that the Russian Revolution wasn't just one event. It was many, many events back to back to back to back. And so there were numerous revolutions completely reinventing themselves constantly. So in 1921, he wrote the book We. And this was the first book banned by the Soviet censorship board. The transcript was smuggled to the West for publication, and due to these events and anger within the party and the Union of Soviet Writers, he was exiled. Due to his use of literature to criticize the Soviet society, Zamyatin has been referred to as one of the first Soviet dissidents. Now, the translation I'm going to read from, you can get free on the vonmises.org website in a PDF. I did make some notes here to change some things. One of them is, it says United State. Now, that is proper, but a lot of other English translations say one state, which makes a bit more sense. Now, this is the paperback book. It is by Penguin Press. You can probably get it from other publishers. But again, the one I'm reading from is, I believe, the original English translation. Excuse me. So, as it were, let's get into this. I'm taking excerpts from this book that are from the first few pages, essentially, that kind of give an outline of this society. But again, realize that the author grew up as a Bolshevik. He believed in the party, and he left the party. So what he talks about here exposes a lot of ideology, a lot of things. So let's get to it. Long live the United States. Or the United State, excuse me. That is the one state. Long live the numbers. These people have no names. They only are assigned a number. Long live the well-doer. My pen is accustomed to figures. It is unable to express the march and rhythm of consonants. Therefore, I shall try to record only the things I see, the things I think, to be more exact, the things we think. Yes, we. That is exactly what I mean. And we, therefore, shall be the title of my records. But this will only be a derivative of our life, of our mathematical perfection of the one state. Now, at the time in Russia, the main central control was trying to use what was called Taylorism, which is a kind of mathematical leadership model that was developed by Frederick Taylor, who lived from 1856 till 1915. So, continuing. It is clear that the history of mankind, as far as our knowledge goes, is the history of the transition from nomadic forms to more sedentary ones. Does it not follow that the most sedentary form of life, ours, is at the same time the most perfected one? Now, if you go back to Tocqueville's saying, he said that people would become sedentary and useless, essentially, and allow all the power to the government. Continuing. There was a time when people rushed from one end of the earth to another, but this was the prehistoric time when such things as nations, wars, commerce, different discoveries of different Americas still existed. Who has need of these things now? I admit that humanity acquired this habit of a sedentary life, not without difficulty, not all at once. When the 200 Years' War had destroyed all the roads, which later were overgrown with grass, it was probably very difficult at first. It must have seemed uncomfortable to live in cities where they were cut off from each other by green debris. Who does not loosen his breath when he runs through the pages of the Guide? The Guide is the book, essentially, in this story that dictates everything that everyone in their society is supposed to do. So of sorts, it's a Bible, and it is almost like a religious text, but it's a secular text. Continuing. The tables transformed each one of us actually into a six-wheeled steel hero of a great poem. Every morning, with six-wheeled precision, at the same hour, at the same minute, we wake up, millions of us at once. At the very same hour, millions, like one, begin our work, and millions, like one, we finish it. United into a single body with a million hands, at the same second, designated by the tables, we carry the spoons to our mouths. At the same second, we all go out to walk, go to the auditorium, to the halls, for the Taylor exercises, and that's your reference to Taylorism there, and then go to bed. So again, their society is highly dictated. It's autonomous, not of their own, but automated by the workings of these tables, these dictates, and everyone follows along as if they are sheep. Continuing, I shall be quite frank. Even we have not attained the absolute exact solution of the problem of happiness, which is like no kidding, because how can you be happy in this society so oppressive? Twice a day from 16 to 17 o'clock and from 21 to 22, our powerful united organism dissolves into separate cells. These are the personal hours designated by the tables. During these hours, you will see that curtains discreetly drawn in the rooms of some. They live in all their buildings are basically glass where you can see into other places. So, picking up from there, others march slowly over the pavement of the main avenue or sit at their desks as I sit now. But I firmly believe, let them call me an idealist and a dreamer, I believe that sooner or later we shall somehow find a place in the general formula even for these hours. Somehow all of the 86,400 seconds will be incorporated in the tables of hours. Now, this is another part. That I cannot understand. True, their minds were rather limited in those days, talking about the time before. This book is set in the 30th century, I believe. Yet they should have understood, should they not, that such a life was actually wholesale murder, although slow murder day after day? Further, is it not absurd that their state, they call it this its state, left sexual life absolutely without control? On the contrary, whenever, as much as they wanted, absolutely unscientific like beasts, and like beasts they blindly gave birth to children. Is it not strange to understand gardening, chicken farming, fishery? Have we definite knowledge that they were familiar with all of these things, and not to be able to reach the last step in this logical scale, namely production of children, not to be able to discover such a thing as maternal and paternal norms? I feel as almost as if you may think I want to simply mock you and with a very serious face try to relate absolute nonsense to you. But first, I am incapable of jest, for in every joke a lie has its hidden function. And second, the science of the one state contends that the life of the ancients was exactly what I am describing. And the science of the one state does not make mistakes. Yet how could they have state logic, since they lived in their condition of freedom like beasts, like apes, like herds? What could one expect of them, since even in our day, one hears from the time to time coming from the bottom, the primitive depths, the echo of the apes? But for you, they are perhaps more mysterious and hard to understand than Newton's binomial theorem. Now, real quick, he is writing to a potential future listener or writer, reader, and he is saying these things as if they're going to be generations and generations and generations down the line. Let me explain. An ancient sage once said a clever thing, accidentally beyond doubt. He said, "Love and hunger rule the world." Consequently, to dominate the world, man had to win a victory over hunger after paying a very high price. I refer to the Great 200 Years' War, the war between the city and the land. Now, it says land here in my paperback translation, it says countryside. And I do want to make a note, is that not how our politics work today? The big cities are basically have a different vested interest than the people that live in more suburban or rural areas. So again, this was seen by a man who was at one point a Bolshevik. Probably on account of religious prejudice, the primitive peasants stubbornly held to their bread. How dare they want to eat their own bread, right? In the 35 year before the foundation of the one state, our contemporary petroleum food was invented. True, only about 2/10 of the population of the globe did not die out. But how beautifully shining the faces of the earth became when it was cleared of its impurities. Now that's important too, because you'll see that a lot in any sort of totalitarian type writings, especially Marxist writings, or any sort of writings where it wants to bring about a one world global government. And the reason why you'll see that is because they don't care about the people, and they think there are too many people. And a lot of people, the more people there are, the harder it is to control. So, of course, it's speculation on my part, but they're rather clear in a lot of what they write about. So anyways, let's continue here with the text. Naturally, having conquered hunger, that is, algebraically speaking, having achieved the total of bodily welfare, the one state directed its attack against the second ruler of the world, against love. At last, this element was also conquered. It is organized and put into a mathematical formula. It is already 300 years since our last historic lex sexualis was promulgated. A number may obtain a license to use any other number as a sexual product. It's great fiction, but it's not the first time that these things have been proposed, and we will come to that. The idea that you can, of course, go up to anybody that you want for the evening and just say, I want you, and they have to comply is rather absurd, especially from people that often scream much about consent of certain matters. So let's continue. The rest is only a matter of technique. You are carefully examined in the laboratory of the sexual department where they find the content of the sexual hormones in your blood, and they accordingly make out for you a table of sexual days. Then you file an application to enjoy the services of a number, so-and-so, or number so-and-so. You get that, or you get for that purpose a checkbook, and it's pink, he notes. And that is all. It is clear that under such circumstances, there is no reason for envy or jealousy. The denominator of the fraction of happiness is rendered to zero, and the whole fraction is thus converted into a magnificent infantileness. The thing which was for the ancients a source of innumerable stupid tragedies has been converted in our time into a harmonious, agreeable, and useful function of the organism, a function like sleep, physical labor, the taking of food. Hence, you see, the great power and logic purifies everything it happens to touch. Now, again, going back to Taylorism, it's a life based on mathematics, a mathematical formula. People don't operate that way. Logic is important. Logic is very important because without reason, we are simply creatures of passion. But without passion, there is no compassion. There is no loving your neighbor. There is no helping anyone else out. So it is very important that we have a society that is balanced in these things. Now back to Alexis de Tocqueville. Yeah, excuse me, guys. I got a bit of a frog in my throat, and it's probably just not going to go away, but I want to get through this. Every nation that has ended in tyranny has come to that end by way of good order. It certainly does not follow from this that people should scorn public peace, but neither should they be satisfied with that and nothing more. A nation that asks nothing of government but the maintenance of order is already a slave in the depths of its heart. It is a slave of its well-being, ready for men who will put it in chains. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is going to lead me to one of the oldest documents of communism that we have, and that is Plato's Republic, where social justice and social engineering are abound. Now, some of this I actually copied and pasted from a very nice little website that has a very brief synopsis of these ideas. So I will link that as well. And I'm also going to link a PDF copy of Democracy in America. Although I warn you, it is like 800 some odd pages, so it's very dense. Although worth your time to explore. So, Plato said this: until philosophers are kings, or the kings and the princes of this world have the spirit and the power of philosophy and the political greatness and wisdom met in one, all these things got to be one, cities will never rest from their evils. Now, the Greek city-states at that time were not united. They kind of had like a loose compact, but they would fight with each other from time to time and usually join together to fight outsiders. It wasn't really until Alexander the Great that Greece was a united kingdom. Before that, it was the cities. And if you lived in the countryside, you were on your own. But getting back to the way the republic is organized, essentially Plato wanted what he called the guardian class, which was the protectors of society. Now, these guardians were essentially raised from children, taken from their families, put in a state school system where censorship kept them from seeing anything that might not make them virtuous. So if it was some sort of wrong think, if it was something that was evil, if it was the vices of the gods they believed in at the time, that this education would not have been taught to them, only what they considered to be virtuous. But then you have to ask yourself, well, who decides what is virtuous and what is not? So, and it also reminds me of Jonathan Haidt's work and his work with anti-fragility. And in that, many of our children today who had helicopter parents or who got participation trophies or had been constantly told that they are perfect little snowflakes, that they are such great human beings, and they've never earned anything, they then become fragile people when they're confronted with real conflict. And even the slightest of conflict, the slightest little thing, they get upset about. Another thing that Plato wanted was a society based on eugenics. He believed that only the best people, the most beautiful, the brightest, should be able to essentially breed and enter into the guardians. And these people would be chosen to be put together so that they could create this perfect human being. Now, this idea of eugenics goes back again to the early 20th century. But again, Plato wrote this 2,000 years before. Another is a caste or class system based on your ability and essentially what he would call your passions. And I'll cover that in a second here. And the other was no family structure, essentially, and sex should be free with whomever and not rejected. Now you might ask, well, how is that going to even happen in the ancient world? Well, there was a plant, a flower that the ancients used. They actually, for some reason, never farmed it, but they essentially used it till it went extinct, called silphium, I believe. That's Silphium. And it has a few other names, but this plant ended up being a natural birth control. So they could control if they had children or not back in those ancient times. But moving back toward the class system, you know, again, we get into ancient metaphysics and the way people thought about the world. And actually, science is sort of discovering some of these things now to be true. And it is, of course, a part of our language. When you get a gut feeling or you feel something in your heart, you know, or you say someone's really heady, meaning they're very logical, these were no different back 2,000 years ago. People spoke the same. We just don't clearly think about them this way, at least for the most part. So the lowest class, he compared to the belly. And the belly of the body being the appetite or the desire. These are the people that probably, he doesn't speak so ill of them, but basically they're laborers. Basically they're the underclass. Basically they're your blue collar people. So they're people that work the fields, they're farmers, they're industrial craftsmen, clerks, and businessmen. So these people were the belly, and again, they are led by their passions, their desires, their appetites. And then there's the heart. And the heart is courage and spirit. Remember, we had that talk about spirit and spirit being about attitude. And these would be the soldiers and the military officers. Also, more or less, the police force to enforce the rules of society. Now, this class of people would be within the guardians. The class below that would not. They would not be taken in to be extra educated, or to be raised to be morally virtuous. And I don't believe personally that there's any way that government schooling of any sort is going to raise anybody to be morally virtuous. But that's an aside. And the final class is the brain, the people that have the reason and the logic, the elites, the people that know better than you about how you should live your life on a daily basis. These were the philosophers, the thinkers, and the rulers. And according to Plato, this would also come from the guardians, but it would only be about 2% of the population. Now, he did put some stipulations on these philosopher kings. He believed that they should live in a form of poverty. But generally speaking, and again, this is what I took from that webpage. I think it's a very good summation of the points here, is the rule of philosophy. Philosopher kings were immune from the provisions of the law and public opinion. Meaning the elites, those people that controlled everything, well, they didn't have to play by the same rules you did. They didn't really need to pay attention to public opinion. They didn't really need to pay attention to the laws. They were above the law of sorts. Point number 2, no unqualified absolutism. Now, this is an interesting statement, but it doesn't quite make sense. It is not all despotism, meaning the rulers just, they're not tyrants. And of course, they're supposed to be benevolent and loving and perfect. But these rulers were held to their constitution, to the articles in the constitution of each city-state. Excuse me. The issue with that is that if you're not held to public opinion or other laws, or there's nothing that anyone can do once you're in power, why couldn't you just violate the Constitution? I mean, to me, all this sounds really familiar because, it's been going on for a really long time in the United States, like a really long time, since the beginning of sorts. Control over the education system. Philosopher rulers should control the education system in an ideal state. So if these rulers, these elites, were, let's say, Marxists, and they think that that is the best way to go, despite all the human suffering that Marxism has brought into the world, and the literature that Marx himself wrote about his disdain and hate toward things like God. No, I don't, you can be an atheist or whatever, but someone has darkness in their soul to that degree, I question their ideologies. So if they rule the education system, what makes you think your society is going to be good? And above, I talked about how they agreed in censorship, which again we'll talk about here in a second. The next point is justice in an ideal state. And justice is actually the main feature of Plato's Republic. In fact, it's most of what the arguments are about throughout all the books within that book. And in their mind, justice was always about a sort of equity, not equality, but equity. And not everyone would necessarily be equal, but you couldn't allow people to get too rich or anyone to be too poor. And I should also remind you, I didn't put this in my notes, but Aristotle spoke of this himself, who rejected Plato's ideas. But Aristotle, who was a student of Plato, he writes in his treatise on politics about how people got what was essentially a universal basic income in the Greek states. And he said that historically, they just crave more and more and more of it. It's not enough. So, according to Plato, though, the justice is bound to every member of the society. It pulls them together and makes it a harmonious type play. And I don't know about that type of justice. A fifth point here, censorship of the arts and literature. In the ideal state, there should be a complete censorship of art and literature. I completely disagree with this. Just as I have titled this channel and talked about with John Stuart Mill, it is AllMinucOne. And you need to understand that deeply, that people need to ration out for themselves. You cannot take away people's speech. You cannot take away literature. You need people to figure things out on their own because they never become developed persons without that. Continuing here on this point, it is necessary so that nothing immoral might fall into the hands of the young individuals. Just think of the children. Just please think of the children. If we don't stop this, think of the children. A system of communism. Plato was of the view that the guardian class should live under a system of communism and property and family. Like I said, they had no wives. They were to share all the women and all the men. It's really kind of crazy. The rulers and soldiers do not possess any property of their own. And apparently that makes people happy. Whenever I talk to people about communism, I always tell them what we're talking about here is delving into a tribal society. It's very simple. Poor tribal societies that first come up, the Rousseauian noble savage, they are always poor, and for their own common good, they have to band together, right? And there isn't a lot of property, and they all hunt together, and that sort of works within a family unit. But the bigger your society gets, the less that works. A great example in modern history was after basically Israel was established as a nation. They had an area called the kibbutz. Now, Israel is still largely a socialist nation, but they do have capitalism within it, so it is what they call the mixed economy. But the kibbutz were where people were very poor, and eventually they left as they gained wealth. And that's exactly what happens every single time. So, in my opinion, communism isn't some ascendance into some better state. It's actually a reversion back to a more primitive state. And if you understand anything about ancient history and ancient governments, other than to some degree, totalitarian nature of them, you will see that these states later on, such as Greece, that people were considered to be free, some people, not all, they were free within this communal system. And there were always issues with it because people always want more, and there are always rulers, and there are always tyrants that come up along. So point number 7 here, equity among men and women. According to Plato, equal opportunity should be given to both men and women for their economic, social, and intellectual, political uplifting. Now, this was rather revolutionary, as generally women in Greece were not allowed to go anywhere without their husbands. They weren't allowed to leave the house. They were kept at home. They weren't really allowed to have a lot of property. The case was a little bit different in Sparta. Women actually had a significant amount of rights in Sparta, but amongst the majority of the Greek states, especially like Athens, this was not the case at all. So this is the last point, and again, I will link this in the description. Principles of functional specialization. Plato was of the view that due to multiple wants, an individual could not fulfill all his desires by himself alone due to lack of capacity. This is called the division of labor. This is very basic economics. Thus, cooperation amongst individuals should be necessary to satisfy their mutual desire. Some people are specialized in performing some certain tasks. Well, yeah, gee, I'm 5'6", and I don't think I'm going to play in the NBA. I also, there's a lot of things I don't think I'm going to do. but I do think that I can read and be rather smart to some degree, at least, because I kind of am. Um, but my point here is that everyone has their own talents. Uh, I'm like a researcher and a reader type. I've done blue collar work most of my life, but it's not necessarily my specialty, right? And some people are great at physics and math and all those things, and some people just aren't, and that's okay. But this is a basic principle of just and good economics. So this, I'll give him that. He gets this point right. So now that we went down that rabbit hole, I want to take you back to communism. And for that, we're going to quote a few lines from the Gulag Archipelago, written by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was once himself a party member and a communist, and he left, or didn't leave the party, but he was locked up for basically criticizing the party, and he eventually left per se, at least mentally, while he was in prison for, I believe, a period of 10 years or more. So, here we go. The communist system is a disease, a plague that has been spreading across the earth for many years already, and it is impossible to predict what peoples will yet be forced to experience this disease firsthand. My people, the Russians, have been suffering from it for 60 years already. They long to be healed. The next one. For us in Russia, communism is a dead dog, while for many people in the West, it is still a living lion. Ideology. That is what gives evil doing its long sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is the social theory which helps to make his acts seem good instead of bad, and in his own and others' eyes, so that he won't hear reproaches and curses, but will receive praises and honors. Essentially, he's saying when you get ideologically possessed, you're not a developed person, and you do not hear proper criticism. You only hear the praises and honors that others give you. Continuing. Thanks to ideology, the 20th century was fated to experience evil doing on the scale calculated in the millions. This cannot be denied, nor passed over, nor suppressed. And here's another one. I don't believe this is from the Gulag. If I'm not mistaken, this is from his time in America when he was teaching over here, giving lectures. Human nature is full of riddles and contradictions. Its very complexity engenders art. And by art, I mean the search for something more than simple linear formulations, flat solutions, oversimplified explanations. One of these riddles is, how is it that people who have been crushed by the sheer weight of slavery and cast to the bottom of a pit can nevertheless find strength to rise up and free themselves, first in spirit and then in body, while those who soar unhampered over the peaks of freedom suddenly appear to lose the taste for freedom, lose the will to defeat it, and hopelessly confused and lost, almost begin to crave slavery again. I added the again. But just you hear the themes here, right? Everything I've been talking about. The quote continues. Or again, why is it that societies which have been benumbed for half a century by lies, they have been forced to shallow find within themselves a certain lucidity of heart and soul, which enables them to see things in their true perspective and to perceive the real meaning of events, whereas societies with access to every kind of information suddenly plunge into lethargy, into a kind of mass blindness, a kind of voluntary self-deception. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, ladies and gentlemen. Now, We're going to go back to Tocqueville very quickly. Tyranny in democratic republics does not proceed in the same way. However, it ignores the body and goes straight for the soul. The master no longer says, "You will think as I do or die." He says, "You are free not to think as I do. You may keep your life, your property, and everything else. But from this day forth, you shall be a stranger among us." Does this sound familiar? Excuse me. From this day forth, you shall be a stranger among us. I wonder who does that. I don't know who does that. You will retain your civic privileges, but they will be of no use to you. For if you seek the votes of your fellow citizens, they will withhold them. And if you seek only their esteem, they will feign to refuse even that. You will remain among men, but you will forfeit your rights to humanity. When you approach your fellow creatures, they will shun you as one who is impure. And even those who believe in your innocence will abandon you, lest they, too, be shunned in turn. Go in peace. I will not take your life, but the life I leave you is worse than death. Now, I don't know who's lost friends over politics lately, but to me that is completely absurd. And the reason why that happens is, like we spoke about the day before, these are people possessed by ideology. They are developed beings. They haven't developed themselves. They hate the world. All they can do is project their shadows upon the world. I got one last quote for you before we wrap up. And this is Tocqueville as well. We can state with conviction, therefore, that a man's support for absolute government is in direct proportion to the contempt he feels for his country. Now, we will revisit all of these people at other times. I just felt like it was a good mash for today. I thank you all for watching if you stayed with me for this long. I really appreciate it for you putting up with my little bit of a tongue tie and also frog in my throat as I'm trying to get through this. I want to ask anyone who enjoyed this to like, share, and subscribe. I will not just be on YouTube. I will be on other platforms, and that will be coming, and you will know. Also, I'm working on my OBS system. For some reason, it's funky. I would love to have overlays for you all so you can read along with me. But for now, it is what it is. So, in any case, I wish you all well. This is AllMinucOne, and my name is Bill. Good night and good luck.